814 warships were bearing down on the Thessara corridor, and every single one of them was going to be dead within the hour. I did not know that yet. Nobody did. Not the admirals screaming for intelligence updates across half a dozen secure channels. Not the senators flooding our communication relays with panicked demands for briefings they were not cleared to receive. Not the Cathara warlords commanding that invasion fleet, who believed they were moments away from seizing the most valuable trade route in the known galaxy. And certainly not me, Simon Cade, senior archivist of the Central Records Bureau, standing in the middle of our war operations room with 9 billion classified files at my fingertips and absolute confidence that I could answer every question anyone would ever think to ask. The operations room was a cathedral of information. Holographic feeds covered every wall and filled the air between workstations with layered tactical displays. Fleet movements traced in blue and red, energy signatures rendered as shifting heat maps, weapons trajectories plotted in sharp white lines that updated 3 times per second, predictive combat models running continuously in the background, feeding probability calculations to the officers who needed them most. 47 analysts worked their consoles around me, pulling data, cross-referencing records, and feeding real-time intelligence to Admiral Helen Marsh aboard her flagship, the Steadfast Resolve. This was the Bureau at its finest. This was what we existed for. The galactic sovereignty had ruled its territories for 12,000 years, and it had done so not because of its military, not because of its Senate, but because of us, the Bureau, and its records. The unshakable foundation of information upon which the entire empire rested. If it existed, we had a file on it. That was more than a motto. It was a statement of absolute truth, tested and proven across 12 millennia of galactic expansion. Every species discovered was catalogued upon first contact. Every ship design was scanned, measured, and classified. Every weapon signature was logged and analyzed against known physics. Every biological profile, every energy output reading, every propulsion system, every language and diplomatic protocol and trade agreement and territorial dispute. 9 billion entries. The most comprehensive intelligence archive in the history of the galaxy, and I had spent 41 years of my life building it, maintaining it, and believing in it, with a conviction that bordered on devotion. The idea that something could exist out there without a corresponding record in our database was, to me, functionally impossible, a contradiction in terms. The Cathara Dominion was proving that confidence justified. They were a coalition of 5 rogue species that had broken from the sovereignty 80 years earlier. Aggressive, well-armed, and hungry for territorial expansion, but fully catalogued. I pulled up their fleet composition in seconds and routed it directly to Admiral Marsh's command console. Every ship class was identified and tagged. Dreadnoughts of the Varak pattern, built in their orbital yards above Keth Prime. Battlecruisers using hull geometries we had documented during the border clashes of 30 years ago. Destroyers, carrier groups, and support frigates, every one matching a known configuration in our files. Every weapon system was documented. Plasma lances operating at predictable frequency bands. Kinetic accelerators with known muzzle velocities and projectile compositions. Fusion torpedoes with classified yield ranges that our scientists had reverse-engineered decades ago. Predicted tactical formations were modeled against their previous engagements, of which the Bureau had detailed records for every major and minor conflict in the past 80 years. The Bureau's analysis gave the sovereignty a 61% probability of victory, but at severe cost. Hundreds of our ships would be lost. The Thessara corridor might be crippled for decades, its infrastructure shattered, and its trade routes disrupted beyond quick repair. It was an ugly forecast, but it was known math, and known math could be planned for. Known math could be survived. Admiral Marsh acknowledged the data packet and began positioning her 512 vessels for interception. I watched her formation take shape on the tactical display and recognized the Enfeld barrier configuration. A solid defensive choice against a numerically superior force. She was using the Bureau's intelligence exactly as intended. Everything was proceeding according to our models. Then Peter Langford, a junior analyst on the far side of the operations room, raised his hand. I almost ignored him. Peter had been with the Bureau for 6 years, and he was competent, but overly cautious. The kind of analyst who flagged sensor ghosts and minor calibration errors with the same urgency he gave genuine tactical threats. I had spoken to him about it twice, but protocol required that every flagged anomaly receive senior review, and I was nothing if not a man who followed protocol. I walked to his console. He pointed at his display without speaking. A single contact sat at the extreme edge of the Thesara system, hovering in a region of space classified in our records as deep, uncharted void. The contact was small, barely a blip on the long-range sensor grid. Our automated identification systems had already attempted to match it against the database. Ship silhouette analysis had run through 47 million known hull configurations in under 1 second. No match. Energy signature comparison had scanned every recorded power output pattern in our files, covering every civilization the sovereignty had ever contacted. No match. Drive emission profiling had tested the contact against every known propulsion technology. No match. Material composition analysis had compared the hull readings against every cataloged substance, natural and synthetic. No match. I stared at the red text blinking on Peter's screen. In 41 years as an archivist, I had seen classification failures before, sensor malfunctions, corrupted data streams, reflected energy from natural phenomena that confused the automated systems. But those failures always produced partial matches. A hull silhouette that was 70% consistent with a known design, an energy signature that fell within the parameters of a documented technology. The system would flag the uncertainty and provide its best guess. This was different. This was not a partial match with low confidence. This was a total failure across every identification metric simultaneously. 5 words in red that I had never seen in that particular combination. Classification failed. No corresponding record. I told Peter it was a sensor error. Long-range detection systems near uncharted space were notoriously unreliable. Gravitational anomalies produced phantom readings all the time. Background radiation from unexplored regions could fool the automated classifiers into seeing patterns that were not there. It was unusual to get a total failure across all metrics, but not impossible. I ordered a manual verification. Peter ran the identification protocol himself, inputting the raw sensor data by hand. Then he called over Nora Whitfield, one of our senior analysts with 23 years of experience, and she ran the same process independently, using a different sensor array. A third analyst confirmed from a completely separate terminal. Same result, 3 independent confirmations. The contact was real, it was present, and it did not match a single entry in 9 billion records. I felt something then. A small, cold sensation at the base of my skull, like a drop of ice water sliding down my spine. Not panic, not yet. Just the first hairline crack in a wall I had always believed was solid and permanent. I pushed the feeling down. I was a professional. One unidentified contact near a major battle was a footnote, not a crisis. Our sensors were pointed at a remote stretch of empty space and picked up something unusual. It happened. It was rare, but it happened. I flagged the contact as an anomaly for later review, tagged it with a Priority 3 classification marker, and turned back to the main tactical display. The Cathara fleet was 4 hours from engagement range, 800 warships bearing down on the sovereignty's most critical trade corridor. That was where the real work was. I should not have turned away. I should not have given it a Priority 3. But I did, because 41 years of absolute faith in the archive had trained me to believe that anything truly significant would already be in the records. And if it was not in the records, it could not be truly significant. 3 hours passed. The Cathara fleet maintained course and speed. Admiral Marsh finalized her defensive formation. The Bureau fed her updated tactical projections every 15 minutes. Our probability of victory held steady at 61%, though the projected casualty figures made my stomach clench every time I reviewed them. 23% fleet losses in the best-case scenario, 41% in the worst case. Real ships, real crews, real lives, reduced to probability margins on my display. Then Peter Langford raised his hand again. I saw him from across the room. He was not looking at me. He was staring at his screen with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Something between confusion and the first dawning edge of fear. The unknown contact was moving, not drifting with the gravitational currents of the system, which is what a stray piece of debris or a malfunctioning probe would do. Moving with purpose, moving with direction, and moving directly toward the Cathara fleet's approach vector. Slowly, deliberately, like something that knew exactly where it was going and was in no hurry to get there. I walked to Peter's console and watched the tracking data update in real time. The contact's velocity was modest, its trajectory clean and unwavering. It was heading straight for the point where the Cathara armada would enter the Thesara corridor, not angling toward our fleet, not fleeing the system, heading for the enemy. I asked Peter how long it had been moving. He checked the logs and swallowed hard. 47 minutes. The contact had changed course 47 minutes ago, and nobody had noticed, because I had given it a priority 3, and only 2 analysts were assigned to watch it. I upgraded the contact to priority 1 and assigned a full tracking team. Then I added a note to the operational log that I would later wish I could erase. Unknown contact moving toward Cathara approach vector. Classification pending. Probable significance, low. I was wrong about that last assessment. I was wrong about everything that day. And I was about to watch the most comprehensive intelligence archive in galactic history prove itself completely, catastrophically, and irreversibly incomplete. Admiral Marsh launched the first salvo at 11 minutes past the 7th watch, and the battle for the Thesara corridor began exactly as the Bureau had predicted. Her forward destroyer screen engaged the Cathara vanguard at extreme range. Plasma lance exchanges lit up the sensor displays in shifting patterns of blue and orange that I recognized from a dozen previous engagements our analysts had studied. The Cathara responded with their standard opening gambit, a massed kinetic barrage designed to overwhelm point defense networks and force the defender to commit reserves early. Our models had anticipated this precisely. Marsh had positioned her interceptor wings exactly where the Bureau's tactical analysis suggested they would be most effective, and the first Cathara salvo was neutralized with minimal losses to our screening elements. I stood in the operations room and fed real-time analysis updates to the Admiral's command ship. Cathara formation density in the center of their line suggested they were preparing a spearhead push, concentrating their heaviest ships for a breakthrough attempt. Their carrier groups were holding back in a reserve position, which meant a fighter screen deployment within the next 20 minutes. Their dreadnoughts were charging weapons that matched energy signatures we had cataloged during the border skirmishes of 40 years ago. Known weapons, known tactics, known enemy. Everything was going according to the models. The Bureau was performing exactly as designed. Then the unknown contact accelerated, and the models stopped mattering. I was watching the main tactical display when Peter's tracking feed updated. The anomaly marker did not drift forward gradually. It jumped. The contact crossed a distance that should have taken hours at any conventional speed, and covered that gap in just under 4 minutes. The acceleration profile was not a curve. It was a step function. One moment the contact was traveling at modest velocity. The next moment, it was somewhere else entirely, as though distance was a suggestion it had chosen to stop following. I ordered a full-spectrum deep scan. Every sensor array within range of the Thesara system locked onto the contact and began collecting data at maximum resolution. The results started flowing into the operations room, and with every new reading that appeared on my display, my confusion deepened into something darker. The vessel was roughly the size of a Sovereignty medium cruiser, approximately 400 meters along its longest axis. Our hull composition scans returned data that did not correspond to any known material in our records. Not an unusual alloy from an uncontacted species. Not a composite we had never analyzed before. The sensors could not properly characterize the hull material at all. The readings kept shifting, fluctuating between states, as though the hull itself was not entirely fixed, not entirely stable, not entirely physical, in a way that our instruments were built to understand. Its energy output was the first thing that genuinely frightened me. A ship of that size, based on every engineering record we possessed, for every civilization we had ever cataloged, should produce energy within a specific and predictable range. There were physical constraints that governed power generation: reactor mass, fuel capacity, hull volume, heat dissipation requirements. These were not opinions or estimates. These were laws, fundamental principles that applied to every species the Sovereignty had ever encountered, from the most primitive to the most advanced. This vessel was violating every single one of them. Its energy output matched readings we would expect from a capital-class dreadnought 10 times its size. The numbers made no sense unless our sensors were malfunctioning, which I personally verified 3 times. They were functioning perfectly. The data was accurate. The data was simply impossible. The vessel broadcast nothing. No identification transponder, no diplomatic codes, no species markers, no communication signals of any kind. It ran completely dark, a void in the electromagnetic spectrum that happened to be shaped like a ship, and was moving toward a battle involving 1,600 warships, as though it had somewhere important to be. I contacted our communications division and ordered them to hail the vessel on every available frequency and protocol. They transmitted greeting sequences in 412 languages, covering every known spacefaring civilization in the Bureau's records. No response. They broadcast mathematical prime sequences, the universal first contact signal that every species capable of interstellar travel recognized as an indication of intelligence. No response. They tried light-based signaling, modulated gravitational pulses, broad-spectrum radio, and even atmospheric chemical encoding on the infinitesimal chance that the vessel's occupants communicated through molecular exchange. No response to any of it. The vessel ignored every attempt at communication with a completeness that felt almost pointed. Not the way a hostile ship maintains radio silence before an attack. More like the way a person ignores the sound of wind while focused on something far more important. I was still processing the failed communication attempts when intercepted Cathara transmissions told me the enemy had noticed the unknown contact as well. Their signals were encrypted, but the Bureau had cracked Cathara military encryption over 30 years ago. We read their internal traffic in real time, and what I heard was a mirror of my own confusion. The Cathara commander, a warlord named Draven Koss, whose tactical preferences, psychological profile, and personal history I had memorized from our files, was demanding identification from his own intelligence officers. They had nothing. Cathara databases were far less comprehensive than the Bureau's, and if we could not identify this vessel, the Cathara had absolutely no chance. Draven Koss made a decision. He classified the unknown vessel as a probable sovereignty secret weapon deployed from a concealed position. A reasonable assumption given the circumstances. He detached 6 heavy destroyers from his fleet formation and ordered them to intercept and destroy the contact before it could reach the main engagement zone. I watched the 6 Cathara destroyers break from the invasion fleet and accelerate toward the unknown vessel on an intercept trajectory. They were fast ships, heavily armed, crewed by experienced warriors from the Cathara military elite. Each destroyer carried enough firepower to reduce a small moon to rubble. I had their complete specifications in the Bureau's files. Weapons ranges, shield capacities, structural vulnerabilities, crew complements, even the names of their captains. Everything documented. Everything known. I had absolutely nothing in the files about the vessel they were racing toward. Not one data point. Not one reference. The destroyers closed to weapons range and opened fire simultaneously. Plasma lances, kinetic accelerators, and fusion torpedoes in a coordinated strike pattern designed to overwhelm any defensive system. I knew the exact energy output of every weapon they fired, because every one of them was cataloged in the records. I could calculate the precise damage those weapons should inflict on any hull material in our database. The weapons struck the unknown vessel, and then they simply stopped existing. Not deflected by shielding, not absorbed in any pattern our sensors could characterize, not scattered, reflected, or diminished. The energy in the projectiles reached the vessel's hull boundary and ceased to be. The sensor data ended at the point of contact. Our instruments could not determine what had happened to the incoming fire because there was nothing left to measure. It was as though the weapons had crossed a threshold beyond which the normal rules of physics no longer applied. I stood motionless in the middle of the operations room and watched 6 Cathara warships pour their combined arsenals into a target that did not flinch, did not maneuver, did not alter course by a single degree. It simply continued on its trajectory, absorbing a bombardment that would have gutted a sovereignty battleship, and it did not slow down by a measurable fraction. Then it responded. I will describe what happened next with as much precision as the Bureau's sensors could provide, which was not nearly enough. A pulse of energy radiated outward from the unknown vessel in a perfect sphere. It had no visual component. It produced no electromagnetic signature that our standard sensors could detect. The only instruments that registered the event were our gravitational measurement arrays, which recorded a spherical distortion wave expanding from the vessel at a velocity our equipment was not calibrated to measure. The wave passed through all 6 Cathara destroyers simultaneously. They came apart. Not in the way ships come apart when struck by weapons. Not explosions, not hull breaches, not cascading system failures triggering chain reactions in fuel stores and ammunition magazines. The destroyers disassembled. Their armored hulls separated into constituent plates and structural members. Those components separated into base materials. Those materials separated into molecular structures that drifted apart like smoke caught in a gentle wind. Orderly, clean, almost elegant in its completeness. 6 warships, crews of 800 on each, 4,800 Cathara warriors, plus weapons, armor, reactors, fuel reserves, atmosphere processors, and everything else that made a warship, reduced to a slowly expanding cloud of disconnected molecules in less than 2 seconds. The operations room fell silent. Not gradually, instantly. 47 analysts and support staff stopped talking, stopped typing, stopped moving. Every pair of eyes locked onto the main tactical display, which was cycling through the sensor recording because nobody could believe what they had just witnessed in real time. I heard my own heartbeat. I heard the hum of the holographic projectors. I heard the soft whisper of the climate control system pushing recycled air through the vents. I heard Peter Langford murmur something under his breath that might have been a prayer in a language I did not recognize. I forced my body to move. I walked to the primary analysis console and began pulling the sensor data apart, layer by layer. I needed to classify that weapon. I needed to match it against something in the records. Anything in the records. I ran the gravitational pulse signature through our complete weapons database. 9 billion entries spanning every weapon system ever documented by any species the Sovereignty had contacted, in 12,000 years of galactic expansion. No match. I ran the energy profile against our theoretical physics archives, models and hypotheses from the greatest scientific minds the galaxy had ever produced, weapons concepts that existed only on paper, energy manipulation techniques that had been dismissed as impossible by peer review committees centuries ago. No match. I ran the defensive capability analysis against every known material, every shield technology, every hull reinforcement system, and every energy absorption mechanism in the records. No match. Every automated classification system in the Bureau was returning the same error code, the same 5 words, displayed in red priority text on every active screen in the operations room. No corresponding record found. I looked up from my console. My analysts were watching me. 47 faces turned in my direction, waiting for the senior archivist to tell them what they had just seen. But because telling people what things were was the Bureau's only reason for existing. We identified. We classified. We filed. We provided certainty in a galaxy that could be chaotic and dangerous and strange. That was our purpose. That was our power. I had nothing to give them, nothing but the silence of a system that had just encountered something it was never designed to process. The unknown vessel had not changed course. It had not slowed or accelerated. It had not communicated. It had obliterated 6 warships using technology we could not identify, absorbed a combined weapons assault without sustaining visible damage, and continued moving toward the main Cathara fleet, as though nothing noteworthy had occurred. I opened a direct channel to Admiral Marsh and reported the Bureau's analysis, using the precise terminology we had been trained to employ in situations of incomplete data. Classification pending, analysis ongoing. But in my chest, beneath the professional language and the institutional composure, something far more honest was unfolding. A foundation of certainty that had taken 41 years to build was developing fractures. And through those fractures I could feel something vast and cold seeping in. Not the fear of the vessel itself, something worse. The fear that the Bureau's records had a hole in them. That the archive was incomplete. That something existed in the galaxy, or perhaps beyond it, that we had never seen, never catalogued, never imagined. And it possessed enough raw power to unmake warships the way a child pulls petals from a flower. The unknown vessel crossed the remaining distance to the Cathara formation. 798 warships remained in the Dominion's invasion force after the loss of the 6 destroyers. Dreadnoughts, battlecruisers, heavy carriers, destroyer screens, and logistical support ships. A force assembled to conquer star systems and topple regional governments. The unknown vessel was one ship. It did not slow down. It did not hesitate. It flew directly into the formation of the largest invasion fleet the galaxy had seen in over a century, and the Cathara opened fire with everything they possessed. I reached for my console and activated a timer function. I do not know why I did it. Instinct, perhaps. The archivist's compulsion to record, to document, to ensure that whatever happened next would be preserved in the files, even if nobody would ever believe it. The timer displayed 0 hours, 0 minutes, 0 seconds. I pressed start. The Cathara fleet died in 12 minutes and 17 seconds. I know the exact duration because I watched the timer on my console throughout the entire engagement, counting the seconds while 798 warships were systematically taken apart by a single vessel that should not have existed. I could not look away from the timer because looking at the tactical display was worse. Looking at the tactical display meant watching ship after ship blink out of existence, each one representing a hull classification, a weapons profile, and a crew complement that I had personally verified in the Bureau's records. Known ships being destroyed by something unknown, the archive's contents being erased by something the archive could not contain. The vessel employed multiple weapon systems during the engagement, and none of them matched anything in our database. The gravitational disassembly pulse I had already witnessed was only one tool in what appeared to be an extensive arsenal. Against the massed Cathara formation, it deployed directed energy projections that cut through capital ships from bow to stern, slicing dreadnoughts in half along their longitudinal axis with surgical precision. The energy beams operated on a frequency our sensors could barely detect, registering as faint gravitational fluctuations rather than electromagnetic emissions. Each beam lasted less than a second. Each beam destroyed a ship completely. It used spatial distortion fields that I can only describe as artificially generated gravity wells, created and directed at will with pinpoint accuracy. Cathara cruisers caught in these fields were compressed, not crushed the way a hull collapses under external pressure, but compressed at a molecular level, squeezed down until 300 meters of armored warship occupied a space no larger than a standard cargo container. The fields appeared and vanished in fractions of a second, each one precisely targeted at a single vessel, each one leaving behind a tiny, impossibly dense sphere of compacted matter, where a fully crewed warship had been moments before. It deployed an area denial system that operated on principles I still cannot explain. Entire squadrons caught within the effect simply lost power. Every system on every affected ship went dead simultaneously, as though something had reached into their reactors and engineering spaces and turned everything off. The ships drifted, dark and lifeless, their crews alive, but completely helpless, unable to maneuver, unable to communicate, unable to fight. Then the vessel picked them off one at a time with the beam weapon, methodically, almost casually, the way someone might tidy up papers scattered across a desk. The Cathara fought back with everything they had. I documented every response, every tactic, every desperate measure the warlord and his captains attempted. Massed plasma lance volleys from 40 dreadnoughts firing in coordinated sequence, pouring enough concentrated energy into the unknown vessel to melt an asteroid. Kinetic accelerator rounds by the thousand, salvos so dense that the projectile tracks on our sensors merged into solid walls of metal. Fusion torpedo launches numbering in the hundreds, each warhead carrying enough destructive yield to crack a planetary crust. Fighter swarms erupted from 12 carriers, thousands of small attack craft flooding the engagement zone and pouring short-range fire into the vessel at point-blank distance. 3 Cathara captains attempted ramming maneuvers, pushing their engines to emergency output and driving their ships directly at the unknown vessel's hull in acts of desperate, suicidal courage that I could not help but respect even as I documented them. Nothing worked. Not a single weapon left a visible mark on the hull. Not a single torpedo detonated against the surface. Not a single ramming ship made physical contact. The incoming fire vanished at the hull boundary, swallowed by whatever defensive mechanism the vessel possessed. The ramming ships were caught by gravitational distortion fields and compressed into dense spheres before they could close the final distance. I logged each attack. I logged each weapon type and its documented yield. I logged the complete and utter futility of 800 years of Cathara military development against a single target that treated their most devastating armaments like mild weather. Admiral Marsh had ordered her fleet to hold position and cease fire the moment the unknown vessel began engaging the Cathara. I could hear her bridge crew on the open tactical channel. Nobody was speaking. 512 sovereignty warships hung in formation and bore witness as the largest invasion fleet in living memory was systematically dismantled by something that their own Bureau of Records could not identify or explain. At the 9-minute mark, the Cathara warlord Draven Kos attempted to surrender. His flagship broadcast a ceasefire signal on all standard frequencies, accompanied by the universal diplomatic protocols for capitulation that every spacefaring civilization in the galaxy recognized and honored. The unknown vessel did not acknowledge the transmission. It did not slow its methodical destruction of the fleet. It did not respond in any way. The flagship was bisected by a beam weapon 14 seconds after the surrender signal was sent. I do not know whether the vessel failed to receive the communication, failed to understand its meaning, or simply did not care. All three possibilities troubled me in equal measure and in different ways. At the 11-minute mark, fewer than 60 Cathara ships remained functional. They had abandoned formation entirely, scattering in every direction, running for the edges of the system at maximum speed. The unknown vessel pursued none of them individually. It simply expanded its area denial field until the effect blanketed the entire engagement zone. Every fleeing ship went dark. Every engine died. Every reactor shut down. 60 warships drifted in the void, powerless and blind. The beam weapon fired 60 times in rapid succession, each pulse lasting less than a heartbeat, each one precisely targeted. My timer read 12 minutes and 17 seconds when the last Cathara energy signature vanished from the sensor display. 806 warships, 12 minutes and 17 seconds. I pulled up the Bureau's historical combat records with numb fingers. Every major naval engagement documented in 12,000 years of sovereignty history. The most lopsided victory on record had occurred during the Periphery Wars 3,000 years ago, when a sovereignty armada outnumbering its enemy 4-1 had achieved total victory in 6 hours through superior technology and tactical positioning. Military historians still studied that engagement as the defining example of overwhelming force applied with precision. The unknown vessel had exceeded that record by orders of magnitude that made comparison meaningless. Alone, against a numerically superior force equipped with capital-grade weapons designed to destroy anything that moved through space. 12 minutes. The operations room remained frozen. I could hear the ventilation system cycling processed air through the overhead ducts. I could hear the soft trembling of Peter Langford's fingers against his console. I could hear Nora Whitfield breathing in short, controlled intervals, the disciplined rhythm she used when she was fighting to maintain her composure under extreme stress. I did not trust my own voice, but I forced myself to speak. I ordered every analyst to begin full documentation of the engagement. Every sensor reading captured and stored. Every weapon signature recorded at maximum fidelity. Every timestamp verified against primary and backup chronometers. Whatever this vessel was, whatever had just happened in the Thesara corridor, the Bureau would preserve the most complete record possible. That was our mandate. That was all I could think to do. Then the vessel stopped. After destroying the last Cathara ship, it decelerated smoothly to 0 velocity and held position in the center of what had been the engagement zone. The term debris field did not apply. There was almost no debris in the conventional sense. Most of the Cathara fleet had been reduced to molecular clouds, or compressed into dense metallic spheres no larger than furniture. The vessel sat among the remains like a monument in a silent graveyard, motionless, broadcasting nothing. It did not communicate. It did not leave. It simply remained. Admiral Marsh contacted me directly over the priority channel. Her voice was controlled, but I had been feeding intelligence to fleet commanders for decades, and I knew what carefully suppressed terror sounded like. It sounded like steady, measured syllables spoken slightly too slowly. She asked me what the vessel was. I told her the truth. I did not know. She asked me what it wanted. I told her the truth. I did not know. She asked me whether it represented a threat to the sovereignty's forces. I told her the truth. I did not know. 3 questions, the same 2 words in answer to each. From the institution that was supposed to know everything, always, without exception. I could feel 12,000 years of institutional authority fracturing with every syllable I spoke. Marsh made the only rational decision available. She ordered her fleet to maintain defensive formation, hold position at maximum sensor range from the unknown vessel, and under no circumstances approach or provoke it. No probing flights, no sensor drones, no communication attempts without direct authorization from the Bureau and the Chancellor's office. She was not going to risk 500 warships against something that had just annihilated 800 in 12 minutes. The arithmetic was beyond simple. It was the clearest military calculation any commander had ever faced. Engage and die. Hold position and survive long enough to find out what happens next. I initiated a full institutional emergency at the Bureau. The last time this protocol had been activated was over 2,000 years ago, during the Convergence Crisis, when 3 previously undiscovered species were detected simultaneously in a frontier sector. That emergency had lasted 6 hours before all 3 species were catalogued, classified, and filed. Standard operations. The system worked. This was not standard operations. This was not a gap in the records that could be filled with a survey team and a classification hearing. This was a void. Every archive in the Bureau's network was opened for deep search. Every database, from the primary tactical files to the deep storage historical records that had not been accessed in centuries. I authorized full-spectrum pattern searches across all 9 billion entries, not just looking for the vessel itself, but for anything remotely connected, any species that might share technological characteristics, any weapon system that operated on similar principles, any anomaly, any unverified report, any myth or legend or dismissed sensor reading from any survey team in 12,000 years of galactic exploration. Hundreds of analysts worked simultaneously across multiple Bureau facilities. Processing power was diverted from civilian networks throughout the sovereignty to support the computational load. The Bureau's classification engines ran at absolute maximum capacity for 4 straight hours, comparing the unknown vessel's data profile against every piece of information the sovereignty had ever collected. The final result was the most terrifying document I had ever received in my professional career. It was 3 words in length. No results found. Not partial matches with low confidence ratings. Not tangential connections that might warrant further investigation. Not ancient legends that could contain some distorted kernel of truth. Absolutely nothing. Whatever this vessel was, it was not merely unrecorded in the Bureau's current files. It was completely absent from the entire accumulated knowledge base of the galactic sovereignty. In 12,000 years of expansion, exploration, first contact, scientific research, and meticulous institutional documentation, nothing like this had ever been encountered, suggested, theorized, rumored, or imagined. I sat at my console and stared at those 3 words, and felt my understanding of the universe shift beneath me, like the floor of a building whose foundation had been quietly removed, while everyone inside was too busy looking at the walls to notice. I thought about my first day at the Bureau, 41 years ago. I had walked through the entrance of the Central Archives complex as a junior classifier, 23 years old, and filled with the absolute conviction that I had found my purpose. The galaxy was vast and complex, and filled with unknowns, and the Bureau's mission was to convert every unknown into a known, to fill the blank spaces on the map with data, to replace every question mark with a classified entry. I had believed, with the fervent certainty of youth, that the task was achievable, that given enough time, enough analysts, enough processing power, and enough institutional discipline, the Bureau could eventually catalog everything worth knowing. 41 years later, standing in the wreckage of that belief, I understood that it had always been a comfortable delusion. Not because the Bureau had failed. 9 billion entries was a monumental achievement, but the achievement was built on an assumption that had never actually been tested. The assumption that we were capable of detecting everything that existed, that our sensors could reach everything, that nothing could exist beyond the limits of our perception. The unknown vessel had shattered that assumption with 12 minutes of casual violence, and the pieces were never going to fit back together. The Bureau was not simply an institution, it was a philosophy. The foundational belief that the galaxy was knowable, that everything within it could be observed, measured, classified, and filed in proper order. That belief was the true bedrock of the sovereignty's power. We did not govern through military strength alone. We governed through certainty. The certainty that we understood the galaxy over which we presided. The certainty that nothing could surprise us. The certainty that if it existed, we had a file on it. That certainty was gone. Dismantled in 12 minutes by a vessel that our records insisted should not exist, deploying technology that our science declared impossible, controlled by an intelligence that our apparatus had never detected in 12 millennia of active observation. If this could exist without our knowledge, what else was out there? What else had the Bureau missed while spending 12,000 years congratulating itself on its own completeness? What other impossible things were waiting in the spaces we had surveyed and certified as empty, in the regions we had scanned and labeled as understood, in the voids between the stars that we had dismissed as containing nothing of significance? Word of the engagement spread through the sovereignty's ruling structure faster than I could contain it, because I could not contain it at all. The Senate demanded a closed emergency session. Military high command wanted threat assessments that I could not produce. Colonial governors from systems across the sovereignty were flooding every available communication channel, demanding to know whether their territories were safe. Ministers, diplomats, scientists, military strategists, and media outlets, all asking the same question in different words. What is it? And the Bureau, the spine of the empire, the institution that had answered that question with unwavering reliability for 12,000 years, was silent. Supreme Chancellor Arthur Dryden summoned me personally to the Capitol. The most powerful individual in the galactic sovereignty wanted a face-to-face briefing from the senior archivist. I prepared my report during the transit, writing and rewriting every paragraph, and each draft felt more like a confession of failure than a professional intelligence assessment. I was halfway through my final revision when a priority alert from the Thesara system interrupted me. The unknown vessel had moved again, not towards sovereignty space, not away from the system. It had repositioned itself with precise, deliberate intent to the exact geometric center of the Thesara corridor, the single most strategically significant point in the entire system, the coordinates where control of the corridor was operationally determined. It had placed itself at the absolute heart of the trade route that both the sovereignty and the Cathara Dominion had been willing to wage war over. And it was powering something up. A new energy signature, different from the weapons, different from the drive systems, massive and building in intensity, radiating outward from the vessel in patterns that our sensors struggled to resolve into coherent data. The Bureau's automated classification systems processed the readings and returned the same result they had been delivering all day. No corresponding record. But this time the energy readings were climbing. Whatever the vessel was preparing, it showed no indication of stopping. It was building toward something, and the sovereignty had no idea what that something was or what it would do when it arrived. I set aside my unfinished briefing report and stared at the live sensor feed on my personal terminal. The cursor blinked, the energy readings climbed. And somewhere in the void of the Thesara corridor, something that the Bureau's 9 billion records said could not exist, was preparing to do something that nobody in the sovereignty could predict. Chancellor Dryden's council chamber was designed to project the full weight of sovereignty authority. Vaulted ceilings carved from polished stone, holographic displays showing the complete territorial extent of the empire in slow rotation. Every surface engineered to remind anyone who entered that they stood at the center of a civilization spanning thousands of star systems, one that had endured and prospered for 12,000 years. I had delivered briefings in this chamber before, always with the Bureau's comprehensive intelligence behind me, always with clear answers and definitive assessments. This time I stood before the Chancellor and his inner council with a data file full of unanswered questions and the growing certainty that what I was about to present would alter the political trajectory of the entire sovereignty. I showed them the sensor data first. The unknown vessel's arrival from uncharted space. Its acceleration profile that defied known physics. Its energy output readings that exceeded the theoretical limits of any propulsion or power generation system in our records. Then I displayed the engagement footage. I had debated whether to include it. The footage was difficult to watch, even as compressed data on a tactical display. But the council needed to comprehend the scale of what had occurred. I played the 12-minute recording at compressed speed and watched the faces of the most powerful leaders in the galaxy cycle through disbelief, then shock, and finally a fear that none of them had ever practiced hiding, because none of them had ever needed to. Chancellor Dryden was a pragmatist, a tall, angular man, with sharp eyes and a decades-long reputation for asking the single question that nobody else in the room wanted to hear. He looked at me when the recording ended, and he did not disappoint. "Is this vessel a threat to the sovereignty?" I answered as honestly as my training and my conscience allowed. The vessel had destroyed the Cathara Dominion's invasion fleet, and the Cathara were the sovereignty's enemy. That fact could indicate an ally. It could equally indicate that the Cathara had simply been obstacles in the vessel's path, removed with no more consideration than a traveler gives to brushing aside a low-hanging branch. Without communication, without context, without any data on the vessel's origins, capabilities, or motivations, I could not construct a meaningful threat assessment. The Bureau did not have protocols for operating without data. We had never needed them. The Council fractured within minutes. Defense Minister Garrett Cole demanded immediate and total military mobilization. He wanted every available warship in the sovereignty converging on the Thesara system within 48 hours, forming the largest battle group ever assembled. Admiral Marsh's chief of staff, connected by secure channel from the flagship, argued forcefully against concentration. Pulling the fleet to one system would leave dozens of others defenseless and might be interpreted as aggression by a vessel that was currently sitting peacefully in the corridor, doing nothing hostile. Senator Margaret Holt advocated for immediate diplomatic outreach. Send an envoy, she urged. Open a dialogue. Demonstrate peaceful intent before the situation escalated through mutual misunderstanding. A smaller faction wanted to seal the corridor, reroute all trade, classify every piece of data related to the incident, and pretend it had never happened. I recognized this response for what it was, the institutional reflex of an empire that had never confronted something it could not categorize. If you could not file it, the instinct said, ignore it until it goes away. The debate consumed nearly an hour. I stood at the edge of the chamber, watching the most sophisticated decision-making body in the galaxy argue in diminishing circles because the Bureau had given them nothing to decide with. No data, no analysis, no historical precedent, no file. Then the vessel decided for them. The communication alert hit every system in the council chamber simultaneously. Priority markers flooded the displays in red. I checked my personal terminal and felt my pulse accelerate. The unknown vessel was broadcasting. Not on a single frequency, on every frequency simultaneously. Every communication band across the electromagnetic spectrum, every gravitational pulse relay, every quantum-entangled network node. All of them at once. A transmission so massively and deliberately broad that every receiver in the Thesara system and several adjacent systems registered the signal at the same instant. The content was structured. Not random noise, not a natural phenomenon, not interference from the vessel's energy buildup. Deliberate, organized communication, repeating patterns and sequences arranged with unmistakable intentionality. But the language was unknown. It matched nothing in the Bureau's linguistic databases, which covered over 6,000 documented languages and dialects. I contacted Nora Whitfield at the Bureau's linguistic division. She had already received the raw transmission data and mobilized her entire team. I told her the sovereignty's senior political leadership was waiting in real time for a translation. She told me she understood the urgency and would deliver results as fast as rigorous analysis allowed. Her team broke through the basic structure within 40 minutes. The transmission was not lengthy or complex. It was short, direct, and encoded in a format that suggested the sender had anticipated the recipients would have limited ability to process it. Nora transmitted the translation to my terminal. I read it twice to be certain. Then I spoke the words into the silence of the council chamber. We have watched. We have waited. The corridor is open. We would like to talk. The quiet that followed those words was the loudest thing I had ever experienced. Chancellor Dryden asked me to repeat the translation. I did. He requested a confidence assessment from Nora's team. She reported 89% accuracy on the core meaning, with a notation that the concepts expressed by watched and waited carried undertones in the original signal structure that implied sustained, deliberate, long-duration observation. Senator Holt said what every person in the chamber was already thinking. Whoever operated that vessel had been watching the sovereignty, for an unknown period of time, from an unknown position, with unknown capabilities and unknown intent. They had been observing us. The word waited implied patience measured not in days or years, but in something much larger. The kind of patience that only made sense across spans of time that civilizations measured their lifetimes against. I was already working on the next revelation. The Bureau's Signal Analysis Division had discovered something embedded within the transmission itself, a compressed data packet, encoded within the carrier wave of the communication signal. When we extracted and decrypted it, we found astronomical coordinates, not coordinates within the galaxy, coordinates for a point in space far beyond the galactic rim, deep in the intergalactic void. I searched the Bureau's exploration archives for any record associated with those coordinates. What I found was buried in deep storage, filed under routine survey logs, from an era when the sovereignty had been aggressively mapping the galaxy's outer boundaries. 10,000 years ago, a survey vessel had scanned that region of extragalactic space as part of a standard rim assessment. The team had noted a single anomaly, a faint energy reading emanating from a point deep in the void, well beyond the galaxy's gravitational influence. They had assessed it as residual background radiation from intergalactic medium interactions, logged it with a standard low-priority classification code, and moved on to the next survey sector. I pulled up that 10,000-year-old log entry and stared at it until the characters blurred. A faint energy reading, dismissed as background noise, filed and forgotten by an analyst who had probably finished their shift and never thought about it again. And now, 10 millennia later, whatever had been generating that reading had emerged from the void and destroyed an entire invasion fleet in the time it took to eat a meal. They had been out there, beyond the edge of the galaxy, watching, for at least 10,000 years. And the sovereignty had scanned them, logged them, classified them as unimportant, and forgotten they existed. Chancellor Dryden made his decision within the hour. The sovereignty would respond to the transmission. A diplomatic vessel would be dispatched to the Thessara corridor under military escort, carrying a formal first contact delegation with full authority to open negotiations. And I would be aboard. The Bureau had to be present for any first contact event. If this was going to become a new entry in the records, it would be documented with full institutional rigor. I boarded the diplomatic cruiser alongside a 6-member team from the Sovereignty's Foreign Contact Division, specialists trained for exactly this kind of encounter. Admiral Marsh provided an escort of 20 warships, though every person involved understood that 20 ships would make no meaningful difference if the unknown vessel decided it did not want visitors. The escort was for institutional protocol, not tactical value. As our small flotilla approached the Thessara corridor, the unknown vessel performed an act that I still think about in the quiet hours before sleep. Its hull shifted. The outer surface began to reconfigure in real time, sections of the vessel's structure flowing and reshaping with fluid precision. Within minutes, a protrusion had formed on the vessel's port side, a docking interface, not a generic universal adapter, a docking mechanism perfectly compatible with sovereignty ship architecture, matching our airlock dimensions, our atmospheric seal specifications, and our structural coupling protocols. It had scanned us, analyzed our ship designs, our engineering standards, our atmospheric requirements, our mechanical tolerances, and it had constructed a matching connection point from raw hull material, in real time, while we watched. The computational and manufacturing capability, implied by that single act, exceeded anything in the Bureau's records by a margin I could not calculate. I reported this to Admiral Marsh. Her response contained a word I will not include in any formal account, followed by a tightly controlled order to proceed with maximum caution. We docked. The connection was seamless, the seal perfect. Atmospheric readings on the other side of the airlock showed a breathable environment, precisely calibrated to our biological requirements, including temperature, humidity, and atmospheric pressure, adjusted to comfortable levels for our species. The interior of the vessel was wrong. I do not mean hostile or threatening. I mean geometrically impossible by every architectural and physical standard in the Bureau's records. The space inside was larger than the external hull dimensions could contain. Corridors stretched farther than they should have been able to extend within the vessel's measured volume. Chambers opened into spaces that made my spatial perception protest. We were met in a large central chamber by a single figure, bipedal, bilaterally symmetrical. 2 arms, 2 legs, a head with 2 forward-facing eyes. It wore no visible armor or equipment. Its features were composed and calm, radiating an absolute, unhurried confidence. It was not any species in the Bureau's records. I ran a visual identification scan through my portable terminal while standing 3 meters from the being, and the system returned the same result it had been delivering all day. No corresponding record. The being spoke, not in its own language but in ours, perfectly accented, grammatically flawless. It had learned our primary diplomatic language from intercepted communications, decoded and mastered it in the interval between its first broadcast and our arrival. It introduced itself as Edward Shaw. It explained that it was representing a species the sovereignty had never encountered, a species that had originated on a small, unremarkable planet in a minor star system on the far side of the galaxy, in a region the sovereignty had never explored because early assessment surveys had classified it as containing nothing of strategic or scientific interest. A species that called itself human. I checked the Bureau's records for the species name, for the planet, for the star system, for any reference to anything connected to any part of what Edward Shaw had just told me. Nothing. Not one entry. Not one footnote. Not one passing mention in 9 billion classified files. Edward Shaw, the human, explained with patient precision that his people had been aware of the galaxy's political landscape for a very long time. They had developed their civilization independently, without contact from the sovereignty or any other galactic power. They had advanced quickly, extremely quickly by galactic standards, and when they reached the stars and discovered they were not alone, they had made a deliberate choice. They did not announce themselves. They watched. They studied. They observed the sovereignty, the Cathara, and dozens of other civilizations from quiet positions at the galaxy's edges, and eventually from installations beyond the rim itself. I asked the question that had been consuming me since the classification failures began. Why were they not in our records? How had the most comprehensive intelligence apparatus in galactic history failed to detect an entire spacefaring civilization? Edward Shaw looked at me with an expression I can only describe as patient sympathy, as though he understood precisely how much his answer was going to cost me professionally, institutionally, and personally. Because we did not wish to be detected, he said simply. Your sensor technologies are impressive for this region of space, but our capabilities moved beyond their detection thresholds a very long time ago. You did not miss us through negligence, Archivist. You were never capable of finding us. 12,000 years of total information dominance, 9 billion meticulously verified entries, the institutional certainty that the Bureau had cataloged everything in the galaxy worth knowing, all of it rendered meaningless by a single calm sentence from a representative of a species that had been standing in our blind spot since before we knew we had one. Shaw then explained why his people had chosen this moment to reveal themselves. The Cathara invasion fleet had been irrelevant to human interests. They had no stake in the corridor, the trade routes, or the political disputes of the sovereignty, but the Cathara had developed something in secret, a weapon concealed aboard their flagship. A spatial destabilization device engineered to rupture the fundamental fabric of the corridor if the invasion failed. If that weapon had detonated, the damage would not have remained local. The resulting tear in the spatial fabric would have cascaded outward through the galactic arm, destabilizing transit corridors, collapsing gravity wells, and rendering an entire region of inhabited space impassable for centuries. The propagation path would have reached human infrastructure beyond the galactic rim. The humans had intervened to prevent that detonation. The sovereignty's survival was a secondary consequence. Shaw allowed that information to settle across the diplomatic team. Then, he shifted the conversation in a direction that none of us had anticipated. Now that we have made our presence known, we see no purpose in concealment. We would like to establish formal diplomatic relations with the sovereignty. We would like a recognized presence within your political framework. And we would like to share information with your bureau. Because while your archivists have been cataloging this galaxy, we have been cataloging a great deal more. And there are things in our records that your civilization needs to be aware of. I stood in the chamber of a vessel that could obliterate fleets, built by a species that should not have existed according to every record I had ever trusted. And I understood with sudden, crystalline clarity that the Bureau's archive was not wrong. It was simply the first page of a document, far longer than anyone in the sovereignty had ever imagined. And someone had just offered to show us the rest. I returned to the sovereignty's capital, carrying a diplomatic proposal that had the potential to either transform the empire or tear it apart. The revelation that a previously unknown species called humans had been silently observing the galaxy from beyond its rim, possessing technology that reduced the sovereignty's most advanced systems to primitive curiosities, drove the political establishment into the deepest crisis it had faced in recorded history. The Senate convened an emergency session that lasted 11 straight hours. I provided testimony throughout, answering hundreds of questions, presenting sensor data, and watching the sovereignty's leadership struggle to process a reality that their institutions had never been built to accommodate. Defense Minister Garrett Cole led the faction demanding immediate military expansion. He wanted every shipyard in the sovereignty operating at emergency capacity, new weapons research programs funded without budgetary constraint, and every border system fortified against what he characterized as the single greatest existential threat in galactic history. The fact that the humans had offered peaceful contact did not reassure him. A species capable of total concealment from the Bureau and total destruction of an enemy fleet was inherently dangerous regardless of its stated intentions. Trust, he argued, was a luxury that civilizations did not survive by extending to unknown powers. Senator Margaret Holt commanded the opposing position with equal conviction. The humans had intervened to prevent a disaster the sovereignty had been completely unaware of. They had initiated communication voluntarily. They had made an open offer to share knowledge. Responding to that offer with military posturing would be strategically catastrophic against a civilization that could clearly annihilate the sovereignty's entire fleet if it chose to. The only rational path forward was full diplomatic engagement. A third contingent, smaller but persistent, advocated for complete withdrawal. Seal the Thessara corridor. Classify every piece of data related to the incident under the highest security protocols. Pretend the encounter had never occurred, and hope the humans would lose interest. I recognized this impulse for what it was: institutional panic wearing the mask of cautious deliberation. Chancellor Dryden listened to every argument with characteristic patience. When the debate had exhausted itself, and the chamber had fallen into frustrated silence, he turned to me and asked a question that nobody else in the room had considered. What did you observe aboard that vessel, Archivist? Not the sensor readings, not the technical data. What did you see with your own eyes? I considered my response carefully before speaking. I told the Chancellor that I had observed a civilization that was not hostile, but was also not impressed by us. That I had witnessed technology so far beyond our own capabilities that attempting to challenge it through military means would be equivalent to a pre-spaceflight society launching stones at an orbital fleet. That Edward Shaw, the human representative, had been patient and forthcoming in a manner that suggested genuine goodwill, but also the perspective of someone dealing with a counterpart at a much earlier stage of development. Not condescension, something closer to understanding. The understanding of a species that had seen many civilizations across many millennia and knew precisely where the sovereignty fell on the continuum. I told the Chancellor that the humans did not need the sovereignty. They were not seeking trade concessions, territorial access, resource rights, or military alliance. They were offering contact because they wished to, not because any strategic calculation required it. That meant the sovereignty had exactly one opportunity to establish a meaningful relationship with the most advanced civilization any of us had ever encountered or imagined. If the empire squandered that opportunity through fear, aggression, or bureaucratic paralysis, the humans would withdraw into the void they had occupied for centuries, and the sovereignty would spend the remainder of its existence knowing that they were out there, watching from beyond our reach, beyond our comprehension, and beyond our ability to ever find them again. The debate continued after my testimony, but Dryden had reached his conclusion. I could read it in his expression. Before the sovereignty's formal response was even drafted, the humans provided a gesture of good faith that rendered most of the remaining political arguments irrelevant. A data package arrived through the communication link Edward Shaw had established. It was described as a small representative sample of human records, translated into formats compatible with the Bureau's processing systems. I oversaw the integration personally. Every available analyst in the Bureau was reassigned from routine duties to process the incoming data stream. When the first results began appearing on our analysis consoles, I understood why Edward Shaw had spoken with such quiet, unshakable confidence throughout our encounter. The humans had not been content with observing a single galaxy. Their records encompassed over 400 separate galactic systems, each one surveyed, documented, and cataloged with a thoroughness and precision that made the Bureau's 9 billion entries look like preliminary field notes scratched in haste. They had mapped civilizations that rose to prominence and crumbled to dust millions of years before the sovereignty's founding species had developed rudimentary language. They had recorded cosmic phenomena that our most brilliant theoretical physicists had never hypothesized. They had charted the intergalactic void itself, the vast, supposedly empty expanses between galaxies that the sovereignty had always assumed were exactly as they appeared: empty, barren, irrelevant. They were none of those things. Buried within the human data were carefully documented references to other entities inhabiting the intergalactic void. Not civilizations in the sense we understood the concept, something far older and far stranger. Things that existed on spatial and temporal scales that made individual galaxies seem small and temporary. The human records described these entities with measured, clinical precision, using observational protocols and classification frameworks that suggested centuries of sustained study. The humans themselves avoided certain regions of the void, not because they lacked the technology to enter those spaces. Their records made clear they possessed such capability. They avoided those regions because they had been there, assessed what inhabited them, conducted whatever analysis they deemed necessary, and concluded that distance was the wiser policy. A civilization that could erase 800 warships in 12 minutes had examined certain parts of the universe and made the deliberate decision to stay away. That single fact occupied my thoughts through 3 consecutive sleepless nights. I shared none of this information with the Senate. Not yet. The political environment was volatile enough without informing the sovereignty's leadership that the universe harbored things that gave the humans reason for caution. That disclosure would come later, carefully managed, after the diplomatic framework was established and the alliance was formalized. Because the alliance was going to happen, Dryden would make certain of it. The Bureau's forensic analysis of the destroyed Cathara fleet confirmed every element of Edward Shaw's account. Detailed molecular scans of the debris field identified trace signatures consistent with a spatial destabilization weapon of the type Shaw had described. The device had been concealed within a modified reactor housing aboard the Cathara flagship, shielded from external sensor detection by the flagship's own energy output. The weapon's engineering was crude by human standards, but its destructive potential was staggering. Our physicists modeled the detonation scenario using the technical parameters extracted from the wreckage. If the weapon had been triggered during a conventional battle, the resulting spatial rupture would have consumed the entire Thesara corridor and propagated outward at superluminal speeds through the region's transit lane network. Admiral Marsh's defense fleet, positioned directly in the propagation path, would have been caught in the cascading spatial collapse. Every one of her 512 vessels would have been lost. 7 inhabited systems within the affected zone would have sustained catastrophic environmental damage as their local space-time geometry was warped beyond recovery. The Cathara had built a weapon capable of destroying millions of lives and destabilizing an entire galactic arm, and they had done so without understanding its full effects. The sovereignty had been preparing to fight a conventional naval battle within detonation range of a device that would have rewritten the map of the galaxy. The humans had seen it. From beyond the rim, from their quiet observation posts in the void, they had detected the weapon, analyzed its potential, and intervened precisely because the consequences extended beyond local politics and into the territory of galactic-scale catastrophe. When this analysis was presented to the Senate in closed session, the opposition to diplomatic engagement effectively collapsed. Even Garrett Cole, confronted with evidence that the humans had prevented the destruction of the sovereignty's primary fleet and the devastation of 7 inhabited worlds, could not sustain an argument for hostility. Formal negotiations commenced within the week. I was confirmed as the Bureau's primary representative on the diplomatic team. Edward Shaw served as the lead spokesperson for the human delegation. The process was unlike any first contact in the Bureau's 12,000-year archives. Standard protocols assumed approximate parity between the contacting parties. 2 civilizations meeting on roughly equivalent footing, each possessing something the other valued, negotiating terms of exchange across a level field. This field was not level. The humans needed nothing the sovereignty could offer. Not our territory, not our technology, not our resources, not our trade infrastructure. They had surpassed everything we possessed by centuries at minimum. The sovereignty, by contrast, needed the humans with an urgency that bordered on existential. Their intelligence on intergalactic threats alone was worth more than the Bureau's entire archive. Their technology could advance our civilization by generations in a single transfer. Their knowledge of what inhabited the spaces between galaxies could mean the difference between the sovereignty's continued existence and its eventual, uninformed annihilation by forces it had never known to look for. Edward Shaw recognized the imbalance and managed it with a grace I found remarkable for a representative of a civilization with such overwhelming advantage. He did not leverage the power differential. He did not impose conditions or extract concessions. He proposed a partnership structured around mutual contribution, even though the contributions were massively asymmetric. When I asked him, during a quiet moment between formal sessions, why the humans were being so generous with a civilization that had nothing material to offer in return, he gave me an answer that has occupied my thoughts every day since. "We have been alone for a very long time, Archivist," he said. "We have watched civilizations rise and decline across more galaxies than your Bureau has catalog entries. Most of them destroy themselves before they achieve meaningful interstellar presence. Some endure for a time and then fade, consumed by entropy or complacency. A few last long enough to become genuinely interesting, and then something from the deep void finds them, and they disappear overnight. Your sovereignty is one of the longest-lived civilizations we have ever observed in continuous operation. 12,000 years of unbroken institutional continuity is exceptional by any standard we have measured." He paused, and something shifted in his expression, something that looked very much like recognition, like a traveler who had walked alone for longer than memory could hold, spotting another set of footprints on a road they had believed was theirs alone. "But it was not your longevity that caught our attention," he continued. "It was the Bureau. You built your entire civilization around the drive to know, to catalog, to understand, to document and preserve. You looked at the galaxy, and your first instinct was not to conquer it or consume its resources, but to record it, to make sense of it, to impose order on chaos through the patient accumulation of knowledge. He met my eyes, and for a moment I did not see a representative of an impossibly advanced civilization. I saw a fellow keeper of records, someone who understood the weight of the work. We recognized that impulse," he said quietly. "We recognized it because it is the same impulse that drove us out of our home system and into the void in the first place. The need to understand what exists beyond the next horizon. The refusal to accept that any corner of the universe is permanently unknowable. We revealed ourselves because, for the first time in longer than I can properly convey to you, we found someone who might understand what it means to be a keeper of records in a universe that never stops expanding beyond the edges of your pages. I understood then, not just the diplomatic calculus or the strategic rationale. I understood why the humans had remained hidden for so long, and why they had chosen this moment to step into the light. It was not strategic calculation. It was not arrogance or indifference, or any of the motivations the Senate's various factions had projected onto them. It was loneliness. The profound, bone-deep loneliness of a species that had outgrown its peers so completely that there was nobody left to share the view with. Nobody who could comprehend the weight of knowing how vast the universe truly was, how much it contained, and how small even the most powerful civilization appeared when measured against the full scope of what existed. The sovereignty and the humans signed a formal accord 17 days after first contact. It was the first such agreement the humans had entered into with any external civilization in over 200,000 years of galactic observation. 17 days to bridge a gap that had existed since before the sovereignty was founded. 17 days to formalize a relationship between a civilization that thought it knew everything and a civilization that had been quietly watching it learn. A joint archival initiative was established at the Accord's core. The Bureau's detailed knowledge of this galaxy merged with the human records spanning 400 others. Two archives becoming one, two traditions of documentation and preservation, separated by an unimaginable gulf in scale and capability, joining forces to build the largest unified repository of knowledge ever assembled in any galaxy the humans had surveyed. The symbolism was not lost on me. The Bureau had spent 12,000 years building a record of one galaxy. The humans were offering to help us see the other 399, and in return, all they wanted was someone to share the work with. Chancellor Dryden appointed me to lead the Sovereignty's contribution to the joint project. He gave me a title that had never existed in the Bureau's history and would never have been conceived before the events at the Thessera Corridor. First Archivist of the Combined Record. I accepted the appointment in a formal ceremony broadcast across the Sovereignty. I spoke the required words and observed the required protocols and maintained the composure that the occasion demanded. But my thoughts were already elsewhere, already reaching ahead to the work that was waiting. Because I had seen the human records, not just the summary data they had shared as a diplomatic gesture. During the negotiations, Edward Shaw had granted me supervised access to portions of their deeper archives as a demonstration of the project's potential scope. What I found there kept me working through the nights long after the formal sessions ended. The warnings, not dramatic pronouncements or alarmist declarations, simple, precise notations in the clinical language of observers who had documented phenomena they considered genuinely dangerous. References to entities in the intergalactic void that moved through spaces where stars had never formed, existing on timescales that made galactic lifespans seem brief. Careful markings on navigational charts indicating regions of the void where even the humans did not venture, not because the regions were empty, but because what inhabited them operated on principles that did not align with the physics of the galactic environments the rest of us called home. The universe was not what I had spent 41 years believing it to be. It was not a finite, bounded space that could be fully mapped and comprehensively filed through sufficient time and effort. It was a living, breathing, expanding expanse of wonders and threats in equal measure. And the Sovereignty's 12,000-year archive, the institution I had devoted my career to, the foundation I had built my identity upon, was a single grain of sand on a beach that stretched beyond every horizon I could see. But a grain of sand was still a beginning. A single entry was still the start of a record. And a record, no matter how incomplete, was infinitely more valuable than willful ignorance. I sit now in my office at the Joint Facility, a purpose-built research station constructed at the edge of Sovereignty space, close enough to the galactic rim that the void between galaxies is visible through my viewport as a field of absolute black between the distant spiral arms of neighboring systems. The human vessel remains positioned in the Thessera Corridor, no longer solitary. Sovereignty research stations orbit it at carefully maintained distances. Supply ships make regular transit runs. A permanent human delegation has established quarters on the nearest orbital platform, and I share meals with Edward Shaw twice each week. During those meals, he tells me about galaxies I will never visit, civilizations that rose to greatness and crumbled to dust before my species had developed the capacity for abstract thought, and the vast stretches of dark between the stars, where things older than light itself move in patterns that even the humans, with their centuries of observation and their technology that borders on the miraculous, do not yet fully comprehend. He tells me about the first human explorers who crossed the galactic rim and looked back at the spiral they had grown up in, seeing it whole for the first time, a single bright structure spinning in an ocean of black. He describes the moment they realized the ocean was not empty, that it had never been empty, that the darkness between the galaxies was the largest habitable environment in the universe, and things had been living in it since before the galaxies themselves had finished forming. He talks about what that knowledge did to his people, how it changed their science, their philosophy, their sense of proportion and purpose, how they spent generations simply adjusting to the scale of what they had discovered, recalibrating every assumption they had ever made about the nature of existence and their place within it. I listen to every word, I record every detail, and then I return to my office and add what I have learned to the combined record, knowing that each entry I file is one more small step across a landscape that has no visible edge. I opened the first entry on my first day in this position. File designation 0001. The first line of the first page of the new archive. 9 billion entries in the old bureau, representing 12,000 years of dedicated institutional effort. The human records spanning 400 galaxies and temporal scales that I cannot fully conceptualize. And here was entry number 1, the beginning. I remember staring at the empty data fields on my display, the cursor blinking steadily against the blank space where the entry text would go. The weight of everything that needed to be documented pressing against my thoughts, like the gravity of a star I could sense but not yet see. I started typing. I wrote the date. I wrote the coordinates of the facility. I wrote a summary of the events at the Thesara corridor, the first contact with humanity, the establishment of the combined record, and the formal accord between the sovereignty and the species it had never known existed. I documented the Cathara fleet and the 12 minutes and 17 seconds that changed the political, scientific, and philosophical landscape of the galaxy. I described a civilization that had been watching us from the dark since before we understood that the dark was inhabited, and the choice they had made to step forward and offer their hand. And at the bottom of the entry, in the classification field where the Bureau had always recorded its final, definitive assessment of a subject's status, I typed something that would have been unthinkable 1 month earlier. Something that the old Bureau would have considered a failure of professional duty. Classification, ongoing, full understanding, pending, estimated time to complete assessment, unknown. The archive never lies. But now, for the first time in its long history, it was being honest about how much it did not yet know. And that honesty, that willingness to look directly into the uncharted spaces of the universe and acknowledge that the page was mostly blank, was the most important thing the Bureau had ever committed to its records. Because the universe does not wait for you to finish cataloging it before it sends something out of the dark that rewrites everything you believed you understood. The universe does not care whether you have a file on it. The stars do not pause their burning while you update your databases. The void does not empty itself of wonders and terrors simply because your surveys said it contained nothing of note. The only thing you can do is keep writing, keep recording, keep reaching toward the edges of the page, knowing with absolute certainty that the page will always extend further than your reach can follow. The humans understood that truth. They had understood it for longer than the sovereignty had existed as a political entity. And now, after centuries of watching alone from the quiet edges of a universe that refused to stop growing, they had found someone willing to pick up a pen and help fill in the margins. I closed file 0001 and opened the next entry, 0002. The fields were blank. The cursor blinked against empty space. I started typing.